On this podcast, well-informed South African climate skeptic Kelvin Kemm talks about nuclear energy and climate realism. If you'd like to skip directly to 8 excellent minutes of climate realism from Kelvin, please jump to the 56:30 mark. Thanks.
I'm a nuclear physicist from South Africa. I'm the chairman of a company by the name of Stratek. It's a nuclear project management company. A while ago, I served a 3-year term of office as chairman of the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation. I live in Pretoria, which is the capital of South Africa. It's 600 kilometers inland from the Indian Ocean.
Do you want to just tell us a little bit about what the situation is in South Africa with the power situation in general, the electricity in general in South Africa?
Well, in South Africa, we have a very good electrical system and a very comprehensive grid. In fact, bearing in mind that we're a very large country, people do not realize how the standard Mercator map projection distorts the image when you look at the standard one. Like Africa as a whole is bigger than China, the United States, all of Europe and India added together. People do not realize that. South Africa alone is the same size as the whole of Western Europe added together. So the distance from where I am now in Pretoria to Cape Town, which is right at the bottom of the country, is the same distance as Rome to London. Now, if you look at a map of the electricity grid over Europe, you cannot close your eyes and put your finger on the map and not hit the power line. Here you can do it easily. There's vast open spaces. So bearing in mind the differences of like that, we got a desert, arid region called the Peru, which is quite famous for its beauty, arid beauty, and it's larger than Germany. Germany has 80 million people in it. So the whole geographic situation is very different. So we've got a good grid. However, the last few years, we've had problems with what we call load shedding, and countries effectively run out of electricity. And that was because of two things. One is the dithering of the government 10 years ago on what to do, what direction to take and to implement the correct decisions which had been taken back then. Then the other thing was this pressure, of course, for wind and solar. So there's been a lot of green pressure to not build nuclear power, not expand the coal fleet. And so now we're in a position where we're in trouble. And so the load shedding sort of comes and goes. Hopefully it'll be gone in the next half year or so. But what load shedding is that we have a national control center at a place called Simmerpan, and they can watch the entire electricity system of the country. And they then switch various parts off according to a schedule. And I've come across news broadcasts in the US and in the UK and whatever, where they make out there's just random power failures all over South Africa every day. That's not true. What happens is a schedule comes out and it says, on Thursday, your power will be off between 8 in the morning and 10 in the morning and 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. It's usually a 2-hour piece, so you get a warning that your electricity is going on. That's causing a huge expansion in the sale of solar panels. And, we can come to that later. So that's a big problem at the moment. And so we're trying to fix that. There's pressure to fix it, in inverted commas, by bringing on loads of wind and loads of solar. But I must say authorities are resisting that, which I agree with entirely. And we're trying to now go in the right direction. I think the philosophy is now correct, and we can discuss that, but we've now got to make sure this all happens. So it's been an eye-opener, and of course, it's happened around Europe. We, of course, owe another very important thing. South Africa is an electricity island in comparison now to Europe. Just recently, I saw a news item that said, Germany is now dependent on the importation of nuclear electricity from France. But the UK for some time has been getting nuclear electricity from France under the North Sea and hydro from Norway. So there have been numbers of occasions when the UK and Germany and a couple of other countries have run out of electricity, like us. But all they do is essentially pick up the phone to the neighbors and bring some more in. So they haven't noticed it. We haven't got any such neighbors. We've got a little bit coming in, but the comparison is like a grade 1 school class where there's a class full of 6-year-olds and the teacher is 26. And you say, well, if one of us falls and hurts ourselves, the others will carry us to hospital. That's fine if one of the kids falls. But if the teacher falls, the children are not carrying the teacher to hospital. And we're like the teacher. We're the big economy. We're the large country. And if we're short of half a dozen megawatts or something, in other cases, just pulling half a dozen megawatts in from our neighbors, they don't have it. So this is why the shortage is really hitting us, whereas England and Germany are suffering similar shortages, but it's covered by the, in inverted commas, insurance policy of the neighbors that are there to help them out.
So do you think the pressure to use too much wind and solar is a major reason behind the load shedding problems, or what is the major reason?
Yes, it absolutely is, without a doubt, because, of course, solar, theoretically, you'll get 25% of whatever is the quoted megawatt figure on average over some period, and wind is about a third. In reality, they don't get that far. They get much less than that. But this just does not sink into newspaper reporters. It's announced 200 megawatts of solar has just been built. And you say to somebody, that means you're going to get 50 if you're lucky over a period of time, and it'll all happen at lunchtime and you'll get nothing in the night. They seem to not understand. Now it's slowly dawning, but it's taken the last 2 years or so to get the occasional news report to point out that there isn't any solar in the dark, and that you only get wind when the wind blows, and then depending on the strength of the wind, you might get 10%, 20, 40, 50% of the maximum output. So that variability is, of course, a big problem. So another problem that I see, and which has already been murmured, is people say, oh, I'm saving electricity by putting lots of solar into my factory, into my house, and so on. What that means is they're using their own solar during midday, and then as the sun goes down, they rely on the national grid. So the national grid is going to stand there to be their insurance policy. And when you say to somebody, but if you're using so many megawatts at lunchtime, why should the utility be on standby to supply those megawatts to you every day? If there's a week of rain and it's overcast, you then just expect the utility to be there. And so that's like asking for free insurance. And the more solar there's put in, the more you find you're giving this instability into the utility. On a sunny day, all of a sudden, at lunchtime, there's not that great a demand. And if it's a cloudy day, then all of a sudden the demand is up. So it's not a simple answer at all.
So do you think there's a lot of pressure from outside South Africa to make you try to run things on wind and solar, or there are true believers making decisions in your country that think they have to do this to prevent bad weather or something?
Well, there's absolutely both. There's a lot of pressure from outside, and we've got a European grouping, primarily led by Germany, that comes here and offers us $8.3 billion to help us get rid of the coal and to move over to wind and solar. Now, this hits the newspapers, a gift of $8.3 billion. Then you find out, well, it actually isn't a gift. Only 10% is money, the other is loans. And then the 10% that's money isn't really money. That's money which they will give to you on condition that you buy what they tell you to buy, which means buy their wind systems. And so out of this 8.3, there's no gift in it. It's a loan, which is expected not only to be repaid with interest, but you also have to pay a royalty on the electricity because you've now used their systems. This type of thing. But it looks so good initially in the newspaper. It looks like somebody has just come along and given you a gift. And then you point out, well, we could put in loads and loads of solar. Where's the power coming from in the dark? So I didn't think of that. So a lot of this is happening, and my personal belief is that it's happening so that politicians back in Europe look good to their own voters. Now, something that has been going around now that you have brought that up is here there's numbers of video clips going around on WhatsApp and so on of masses and masses of trucks lined up full of coal going through to ports, so going through to Maputo. The normal coal export facilities are just used up. South Africa had absolute record exports of coal last year. Unbelievable. The figures that were astronomical, the dividends that got paid to the shareholders and the coal companies. And so I'm not exaggerating. If you see like 200 trucks, one bumper to bumper going down to the border post to get through to Mozambique, because they're using the Maputo harbor to try and get the coal out to Europe, to places like Germany. We hear them say, they moving away from coal, they want to buy all our coal at the same time arrive here and tell us don't use it, buy our wind. And it's incredible. Where's that coal going? You see, it's not going nowhere. We know where it's going.
So, was there any a golden time in the past that you didn't have load shedding, or has that?
Oh yes. Throughout my life, there's never been load shedding until very recently. A couple of years ago, we had it a bit for the same reason. But South Africa's always had a very good electricity system, very stable, excellent one. And that's been a factor in the great economic growth that the country had in years gone by. In the 1960s, South Africa had the world's second highest GDP growth after Japan. And one of the reasons was the far-sighted people at the time made sure there was a road and rail infrastructure, electricity, steel manufacturing, all the big things that government should be doing as support to business and industry going out and actually being the players. But I like to make an analogy, actually, that it's something like a game of soccer. And the soccer game is the players play. The government's job is to provide the field, put the markings on the field, ensure that everybody understands the rules, to provide a referee who's schooled in the rules, and then when the whistle starts for the game, the government must just make sure that the field is bare and various facilities around the field. The government must not start telling the players who to kick to who and when and how and what the game plan is. And unfortunately, that's happened too much, not only here, but around the world. I'm seeing it happening in the United States. I'm seeing it happening all over, where governments are deciding how they want people to live and instructing people on what they must do, how you must make energy, and so on and so forth. And that shouldn't happen. And that's been a significant part of the problem.
So, it must be a major issue politically that voters must be getting disgruntled over the load shedding, and they want to elect people who are going to
Very
give them
much.
reliable power. And do you think
Yeah.
sanity is coming back as we speak?
Well, that's been very much the case. We got a general election next year, just like you've got a presidential election, and there's a lot of feelings going around now as to what may or may not happen in the election. The government is aware of that. You can see certain changes have taken place in the right direction. But there's still those proponents in the country that are pro-wind and solar, and those that are not. I must say we've got quite an active pro-nuclear group here as well. Something I must also say, which is very beneficial, is we've got a pro-nuclear energy minister who's been like that all of the time, a pro-nuclear finance minister, and a number of them. So we don't have the problem that they have in a place like Germany, where right at the top in the government, you've got these people that just believe that somehow wind and solar is going to just deliver when in reality is it can't. I'm not opposed to wind and solar. I've honestly never in my life, of all the writings I've done, all the TV appearances I've done, and anything, I've never once ever condemned wind and solar out of hand, which of course the anti-nuclear people do all the time. They just condemn nuclear full stop. I've never ever done it. It's been a policy. There's all sorts of things you can do with wind and solar where they're appropriate, but you're not going to run an electric train 1,000 kilometers on wind and solar. It's just not going to happen. But if you want to pump water up into dams, there's all sorts of things that you can do with wind and solar. And the challenge should be to think of the clever things to do with wind and solar where they really work well, and not try and push them in to the national supply where wind and solar goes up and down like this. So it's an absolute headache for the national controllers that are trying to generate a stable supply. People don't realize how important it is for there to be stability in the supply.
So, engineering wise or rationality wise, what do you think would be the best solution to power South Africa maybe 50 years from now?
Well, I believe we've got to stick with the coal. 80% of our electricity is coal. We're one of the highest coal users in the country, but nevertheless, our CO2 output is like 1% of the world. So we're getting hammered from various quarters to cut that by a third and so on. Now, a third of our 1%, and other countries are growing more than that virtually monthly. is silly. Also, something which is a bit silly, as much as one needs to say we have to look towards the later generations, you cannot say we would put so much attention to our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, we let the current people die. You can't do that. You've got to ensure you look after the current people. And this is what's happening now. Things that should be done for the current people, like ensuring hospitals, transport, housing, and all that is not happening because everybody's worried about the grandchildren. There won't be any if they let the current people die. So, we have got a positive attitude from government. In fact, some time ago, the energy minister announced another 2,500 megawatts of nuclear power will be added to the existing nuclear in South Africa, and the request for proposals is due to go out sometime at the end of the year, early next year. So it is going ahead, and there are not major brakes being put on the nuclear development. But coal we need, and then nuclear. Now, I think also that what's happening now in the world is going through a natural transition from coal to nuclear. I've got some pictures that I use in presentations. Like if you look at London and New York at the end of the 1800s, early into the 1900s, you see pictures on the street of motor cars and horse-drawn carts going down the road together. And people at the time were saying, oh, these cars are this newfangled toy of the wealthy, but the real strength of the economy lies in the horse-drawn transport. The First World War. It's amazing to think that when the First World War broke out, the major transport systems of all armies were still a horse. And it was inevitable that the one would take over the other, like with shipping. The wooden ships, I love looking at a wooden ship. You don't often see them with sails flying, particularly like the Cutty Sock, which I visited for the third time in London a month ago. Those look beautiful. And then the sort of clanky, steam-driven, coal-burning ships came about, and the maritime people at times said, oh, but those wooden ships are so beautiful, and these clanky other things are so horrible, they'll never take over. But they did. And we like that now with nuclear power with respect to coal. If you just leave it alone, the natural forces of economic growth and engineering, perception, and so on will cause nuclear power to take over from coal. And 50 years' time, later than that, wherever, school teachers at school teaching history will say, you know what, it was so surprising in the early 2000s that people could not see that nuclear would run the whole world. You know how those people were so funny, they were hanging on to their own ways. Why didn't they see the future? Just like the horse-drawn cart guy when it was said in 1925 or something like that. We're in the same boat. So the best way, if you want to get rid of the CO2, which is another thing I don't believe in, by the way, but it's just now for political reasons, trying to reduce CO2 output. The best way to do it is to try and bring nuclear in as quickly as you can that will naturally displace the coal. And to my mind, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, and you think nuclear wins because it wins on safety and reliability and power density and cost, and not because of CO2 is going to harm anyone's grandchildren, correct?
Absolutely. Nuclear wins on everything. Nuclear is the safest. There's no doubt about that. Nuclear is the most green. Nuclear is the one that produces least waste of any sort. And it doesn't produce any CO2 if CO2 is something that's going to worry you. So it doesn't do any of that. So nuclear just wins. When the nuclear reactor is running, a nuclear power station is running, it produces absolutely nothing coming out of it, no waste whatsoever. And there's no radioactive gas or anything that comes out. There's no liquid coming out. There's no water running into the river or into the sea or something carrying nuclear waste. And no solid material. Nothing comes out. Now, the solid material ranges from somebody taking a paper towel and wiping down something that could conceivably have a radioactive residue on it. That's low-level nuclear waste. Intermediate nuclear waste is a pipe that had radioactive stuff running through it. You now to replace the pipe, which is getting old. And that pipe is a bit radioactive. That's called intermediate. Then high-level waste is a spent fuel element. When it's used up, you take it up. All three are not allowed out of the building except under very stringent conditions, and they have to be then taken to a nuclear waste repository where they are stored forever. And I emphasize the word stored, not dumped. The extreme greens like talk about the dumping of nuclear waste. If somebody goes with a truck and nobody's looking, you throw the nuclear waste out the back of the truck. No, South Africa's got a nuclear waste repository. One of the oldest and biggest in the world, by the way. It's 10,000 hectares. And this year it is 38 years old. And it's been running beautifully, and it takes all the intermediate level waste and all the low level waste, which also comes from hospitals, for example, where there's nuclear medicine used in cancer diagnostics and cancer therapy and things like that. So any swabs or paper towels or gloves or whatever get put into drums and taken up, numbered, and then recorded exactly where it is and so on. So the sort of fear of nuclear waste is somehow there's nuclear waste lying around. It's just not true. It is very, very carefully stored. So the safety thing is really, it surprises me that people are concerned. But of course, I know that since the Second World War, when the bombs went off, that was the worst public relations birth any new technology you could have, blowing a couple of towns away. But ever since then, there's been people that have been playing on that. Say, oh, you can't have one of those near where you live, and this type of thing, and emphasizing false stories about the waste. So people are scared, I understand it. But then the nuclear fraternity, the nuclear engineers, have not done themselves a good service at all by keeping so quiet over many years. Still, they don't talk very easily, so they don't go and correct it. You sit around the table with engineers, and they grow up like crazy to each other about that horrible article in the newspaper that spoke such nonsense, how the people get the wrong impression. Then you say, what are you going to do? Well, I'm not actually going to do anything about it. And see, I'm not very good at that. And so nothing ever gets done. And without a doubt, the Greens are much better at making a noise and jumping around in public and so on. So that has been a problem, and we need to counter this disinformation that gets spread amongst the public.
What do you think is the best way for us to counter that disinformation? And as a separate question, are young people going into this industry in South Africa, or do they think it's a bad thing?
Oh, yeah. No, they are. In fact, here we've got an organization called SANUPS, which is the South African Youth Nuclear Professional Society, and it's got about 300 members, which is substantial. And they do quite a lot of work. And then there's an Africa one as well. They belong to another grouping, which is the Africa Youth Nuclear Movement. And they have meetings in different countries, and they get substantial turnouts. So there's a very enthusiastic young group here. And so that's very pleasing to see. And they've got a good future. I think they're in the right place at the right time now, because for me, for the last 20 years, it's been a case of just fighting the battle of the extreme greens and so on and so forth. I never thought it'd be like it. Now, all of a sudden, things seem to be coming right. And I believe over the next 2 or 3 years, next 5 and 10 years, there's going to be a rapid acceleration in favor of nuclear. Right now, you're seeing it being built all over the world. So I think the people that are now coming out of university, the young people, have got a very positive nuclear future ahead of them.
Are you in contact with some of the other people that I've even interviewed, like Cal Abel and Robert Zubrin, Wade Ellison?
Yes. Wade Ellison and Cal, so on. Yes, I've met Cal. Wade Ellison I haven't met face to face, but we know each other well from WhatsApp and email and so on.
And I do see that there's some young folks on Twitter that are promoting nuclear power, and they're on YouTube and stuff. I think that's a very positive thing. Yeah.
Yes. We've got a couple in South Africa that are doing very well, getting exposure all over the place. So that's great.
Do you think you're making headway in South Africa, or do you think the general public still thinks that Fukushima was just a terrible thing that killed tons of people?
I think we're making headway. We've never been as bad as we see in other countries. We have our anti-nuclear demonstrations and so on, but the general public, I think, has been quite a bit more sensible here than in other places. So I think we're making headway. And right now, interestingly, numbers of trade unions and so on are coming out very pro-nuclear. Political parties are coming out pro-nuclear and so on. So it's quite interesting to see the pro-nuclear sentiment. Now, you mentioned Fukushima. It's a good image to have in mind, because, I find so many times people will talk to me in a pub or something and say, but look what happened at Fukushima. And I say, yes, what did happen at Fukushima? And they say, well, I don't actually know, but look what happened there. Now, at Fukushima, how many people died from nuclear radiation? 0. How many people were injured by nuclear radiation? 0. How much private property was harmed by nuclear radiation? 0. And I wrote an article about this at the time and said it was not a nuclear disaster. It was a conventional disaster. And often when one writes articles for newspapers and so on, the convention is you allow the editors to choose a title, because they pick sometimes a more dramatic title than you might think of yourself. And I wrote this article for somebody in Washington, and it was published in Washington. And the article came out in Washington with some sort of headline like, Fukushima was not a nuclear disaster. Next minute, it was like international war broke out between those that were saying, I'm a terrible person, I don't know what I'm talking about, and then others that said, no, he actually does. And interestingly, one of the very first people who came out well and truly and supported me was Dr. Wade Ellison. And interesting, I had virtually nothing to do with it after a while. I was like watching, ballistic missile. I was actually watching from one side to the other, shooting at each other about what I'd said. And Wade Ellison said something to say, well, that's the one chap who's actually being sensible. And all other people said, yes, he's right. And others said, no, he's not. But Fukushima is a case in point. And actually, there's been a bit more just recently with Fukushima, because they've spoken about releasing all this water that they've been storing up into the sea. And there's now people going, you can't release all that radioactive water. Well, in fact, about, I think, 6 years ago or something, there was a function here in Pretoria. Interesting little fact, by the way, that the city in the world that has the most foreign embassies in it is Washington, D.C. The city in the world that has the second greatest number of foreign embassies in it is Pretoria. Yeah. And I was at a function where the host was the Japanese ambassador. And I was talking to the Japanese ambassador on this issue of the radioactive water that they were collecting. And this is when it rains, by the way. When it rains and there's rainwater that's running across the ground, they pick up the rainwater and put it in a tank. It's not water just leaking out of the nuclear reactor. So there had been some issues about this radioactive water. I said to Mr. Ambassador, you take me to Japan, I'll drink that water on live television, I'll swim in the tank of that water as much as you want me to. Put me there and I will drink it and I will swim in it and show everybody that it's harmless. And he said, well, that's a good idea. Maybe I'll tell my superiors and see, but nothing ever came of it. Right now, I make the same offer. I'm happy to go there and drink the water. I'm happy to go there and swim in the water. It's so foolishly mild, and yet there's such an issue being made about it being gently leaked into the sea, which is by far the best thing you can do with it. It was exceedingly mild. So Fukushima was a conventional accident in the sense it was a financial disaster for the owners, but it was not a nuclear disaster. If an aircraft hangar at an airport catches fire, and in it are 3 parked aircraft that are destroyed, you don't declare that a major air disaster. The planes were parked inside the hangar. The fact that you lose 3 aeroplanes is not a major air disaster, it's a major financial disaster for the owners of the aeroplanes. And so, there's been a lot of these hubs, like Fukushima being a classic. Yes, look at Fukushima. So what happened? No, we don't actually know, but look at it. It's common.
So do you think some of the modern nuclear designs are too safe, or they have so much concrete around them they can take hits from an F-15 plane flying in? What do you think about that?
Yes. No, they are undoubtedly, because during the fear periods of the 70s, should I say, the US was building nuclear like crazy in the 1970s, and then the anti-nuclear sentiment set in and so on. And part of the technique of the extreme anti-nuclear lobby was to try and price the reactors out of existence. They wrote about it, I can remember. And so they demand safety, and so on. So undoubtedly, there's huge cost in the building of a nuclear reactor because of the massive safety that is required, far more than you'd have anywhere else. Just a while ago, I was driving my car and I went near some of these big new wind turbines. Parked my car on the side of the road, got out, climbed over the waist-high cattle fence, walked right up to the wind turbine and stood there and touched it. And I noticed there's a notice on it that said, "Beware of falling ice." So I thought, well, that's all I need is a couple of kilos of ice to fall on my head, but it wasn't the type of day that ice. And I thought, here I'm standing underneath this giant turbine. One of those blades could fall off, the turbine could fall over. There's all sorts of things you can speculate could happen, but there was absolutely no defense around that thing other than a cattle fence. Now, if that had been a nuclear installation, they would have demanded concrete walls, high fences, searchlights, guard dogs, heaven knows what would have been demanded if it's a nuclear station. And so there's been absolute excess. But another thing that's important to note in a nuclear game is that a lot of technological progress has taken place. I'm forever saying, look at the technological progress that's taken place with solar panels. I agree. I'm a physicist. Incidentally, Einstein won the Nobel Prize. He discovered relativity and all that. But few people know that Einstein won the Nobel Prize for working out how the photoelectric effect worked, how solar panels work. Was the committee were too scared to give it to him for relativity because there was still such a debatable point as to whether he was right. They said, well, let's sort of give him the Nobel Prize, but we give it to him for the photoelectric effect. And that was a mystery until Einstein figured out why it worked. So there's been undoubted great progress in solar panels. There's been great progress in those wind turbines. They're a marvel of physics, of those huge blades. They don't pull themselves apart because the forces on those things and so on. No doubt about that. But there's been great advance in nuclear power as well. And people seem to think that all current nuclear reactors are being built the same as the ones in the 1970s. I said, but you're not driving a motor car that was conceived in the 60s, built in the 70s. You're not buying a motor car that was designed and built in the last 5 or 6 years. Yes, look at your computers. Look at this. This is all half a dozen years old or a couple of years old. Why do you think we would build 1970s nuclear reactors now? We're not. And most of those in the 70s were what's known as a Generation 2 reactor. We then went through Generation 3, conventional pressurized water reactors, which are huge advance, and then Generation 3 plus as well. And a big factor is that they've gone to what's known as passive safety. Now, whereas in Chernobyl, in 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima, in each case, the problem was that you needed pumps to pump cooling water through the reactor. If the pump stopped working for some reason, your cooling water stopped flowing, and that's the problem. With a motor car, if you've been riding some distance in a motor car and you stop and you get out, the engine block is full hot. Most cars, he says, the fan keeps running for half an hour or an hour or something after you get out of the car to cool the engine block after you've turned the engine off. Now, the same happens with a nuclear reactor. In the case of Fukushima, it switched off. Fukushima survived the earthquake with no trouble. The earthquake shook the ground. Fukushima switched off, put itself into an off situation, but it still had that residual heat in it, like the residual heat in the engine block of a car. And Fukushima needed the pumps to keep circulating the water. In the case of a car, you need to circulate it for half an hour or something. In the case of the nuclear reactor, you talk about half a dozen days. And when the circulation stopped, because of the tsunami that then arrived 55 minutes later, that's when the trouble started. It was the water arriving that caused all the trouble because it stopped these cooling systems from taking the residual heat out of the reactor. So as a result of those sorts of things, redesigns took place, and now there's a lot of passive safety. What that means is you work with the laws of physics. So that if something goes wrong, gravity will cause water to fall down into the right place, not like Fukushima where the water fell down into the wrong place, and so on. So this has been designed to a great degree. So now you get Generation 3 plus reactors typically have almost, I would say, 100% passive safety, that they just can't do what Fukushima did and so on. And then you have another generation now called Generation 4 reactors, which are largely small modular reactors and are completely different types of technology and also very much build in passive safety. South Africa was the first country in the world to start designing a commercial small modular reactor. We started in 1993. Many countries have started in the last year, 2 years, 5 years, but we've been going since 1993. And that is a small modular reactor, gas cooled with helium. And it was designed completely with passive safety built into it from step one. We said, okay, we understand all these things now because society changes its demands. When the first reactors were built, engineers are human as well, believe it or not, and they would sit around the table and build the most efficient machine. And unless somebody said to them, make it super, super safe, not that it didn't occur to them, I don't want to create the wrong image, but whatever the social criteria are that are presented to engineers when they pick up their first pencil and first piece of paper, that determines the outcome. So now they're much more aware of those sorts of things. So when we started to design the first small modular reactor here, we put all of that in. And there was a sort of a joke going around, which is perfectly real. They said, look, if the worst happens to the reactor, the worst conceivable accident, the best thing we could all do is we all go down to the pub and we sit in the pub and we have a chat and we decide what should we do about it. Because it's been shown without doubt that the reactor can rise to a maximum of 1600 degrees Celsius. There it'll sit for a day or two and just over the next few days to cool itself off with no human intervention whatsoever. And the reactor materials or whatever are designed to take 2000. So we still have 400 degrees to go, which is massive. And that's still the case. Since then, we designed a reactor which will be cheaper to build and faster to build, called the HTMR 100, which is what we're wanting to try and build now in Pretoria. That's what my company is trying to do, looking for the international finance to do that. We're getting a large reaction from around the world. But that one is absolutely walk-away safe. That's what the term is now used, walk-away safe. But if something really goes wrong, you just say, oh, yeah. There's no panic stations and worrying about things splitting open and so on. And there are a lot of design criteria in it that have been designed like that to get that result.
Are those small reactors a better solution then for maybe the interior of South Africa? I think you've mentioned that it's harder to get water in the interior, or do I have that wrong?
Yeah, that's right. But, when one makes cans of jam or when you make loaves of bread or anything like that, the rule of thumb is if you go for mass production, your price per unit comes down. But if you're making bread and you can produce a lot of bread, you're selling it to the local neighborhood. Like if you use the US analogy, it's unlikely that somebody's making bread in New York and selling it in Georgia or selling it in Minneapolis. But if you are, then the transport costs from the place you're baking it to the customer become a factor. And that you have to take into account with electricity. So they use the same psychology to say, well, let's build bigger and bigger and bigger nuclear reactors because you've got effectively the mass production factor there to bring the unit cost down. But then somebody would have to say, wait a minute, if we're now moving this electricity 500 kilometers, which is what happens here at the moment, incidentally, as I said, 80% of South Africa's electricity comes from coal. But as it happens, all our coal tends to be clustered in the far northeast of the country. So on the other side of Pretoria, where I am now. So the distance from where the coal fields are to Cape Town is the same distance now as Rome to London, as I indicated earlier. So trying to push the electricity all the way from Rome to London. When I was in London, I said to some of the people in London, I said, how would you like it if more than half of your electricity comes from Rome? And they looked at me shocked and they said, that would be so stupid. I said, well, that's what we do, you see. Because now, when South Africa built its first nuclear power station, a 2,000 megawatt power station, it was put in Cape Town for that reason. The planners of the day said, look, we've got to start pushing electricity from the bottom up. You can't take everything. You couldn't supply the whole of Western Europe, for example, from Rome with electricity, which just sounds foolish. But we're effectively doing it. We're pushing 80% of the country's electricity from the coal fields. So we need to put other power stations. And what we need is a combination of big stations, and a new one, say 3,500 megawatts, but they need to sit on the coastline because they need big cooling. And South Africa is generally a dry country, so the cooling we require is the ocean. So we can put them around the coast. We've got the Atlantic coast and the Indian Ocean coast. We've got a lot of coastline to put big reactors. They can be there and then supply an immediate area. But some of South Africa, all South Africa's big gold mines, some of the big industrial areas are deep into the interior of the country where there isn't water available in vast quantities. We battle with water here. And so we had to say, well, how do we come up with something that you can put power stations in the middle of the country with no water? And that's where the small modular reactor thinking, I said, it must be water-free, no water cooling. So the idea was come up with helium. So we decided to use helium gas for a number of reasons. If it leaks out, it can't get radioactive. The physics doesn't allow helium to get radioactive. So it can't get radioactive. You can breathe it in if you like. You can go to the supermarket and buy these balloons that have helium. They sell to kids, and there's a trick. You can breathe the helium in and you speak like Donald Duck. So it's completely benign. And so it's a really ideal cooling material to use for a number of factors. And this is why, as I said, with the mass production of electricity, if you're looking only at the big power station, you can't do that. You want to say, where must that electricity end up? And if it ends up 500 plus kilometers away, then you got to take the transmission costs into account. And you say, wait a minute, it's now cheaper to build smaller reactors closer to the consumer. That then opens up other possibilities as well to say, why do you need a national grid? You don't. Texas, for example, is not connected to the rest of the United States. It has its own grid. You don't need an electric grid over the whole country. It just happened like that historically, organically. Electricity started in, for example, in the US and New York. One of the very first towns in the world to get electricity, electrical streetlights, was Kimberley in South Africa, about 2 weeks ahead of New York. And then New York got some, and then London got some. But they only had it down a street or two, and then it moved a block and a block and a block, and eventually this organically went, and so on and so forth. You didn't build a national grid across the whole of the United States before you turned the power on. It crept along. So now you say, well, must we keep doing that? When you go to some of the large countries in Africa that are just vast expenses with big distance between population centers, why build a grid and put 500 kilometer power lines between one place and another with nobody in between? Why don't you just put power at each end? Which is what you can do with the HTMR 100 or any small modular reactor. By the way, the International Atomic Energy Agency defines an SMR as less than 300 megawatts. So you can go and put a 300 megawatt power station at some place, and it can have a grid which is, say, 5 kilometers in radius, 10 kilometers in radius, and that's that. That will supply an entire industrial area, can supply an entire big gold mine. And in our case, the gold mines are big, by the way. The deepest hole in the world as human beings can go down is here. And it's just about 4 kilometers down, which is quite a thing. I've been to the bottom. If you go to the very bottom and stand for 2 feet on the deepest place on the planet that a human can stand, when you get back to the surface, they hand you a certificate to certify that you've been there. And I was there, and my certificate says 3,777 meters down is where I stood. And the wall temperature is hot down there from the heat coming from the center of the earth and so on. But you're still digging gold down there. And it's a long journey. In my case, it took nearly 2 hours to get to the bottom. So, and incidentally, in a South African gold mine, you can have 4,000 or 5,000 people underground in a shift. There's 100 and something levels down. It's very risky to be in a position where a large gold mine with 4,000 people underground suddenly loses electricity. You just can't have that. Not only does it go dark, but the air conditioning stops and the lifts stop and so on. And so running a gold mine with its own nuclear reactor is great. And it's the right sort of power size. We're having 200 megawatts or something provided by a small modular reactor. You can supply not only the mining complex, but the local town and various other things. And there's no reason for them to connect to the national grid. So when you look at countries that are interested in nuclear, such as Uganda, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and various others already indicate their interest. So why worry about adding to the national grid? Just go and find a place where you like electricity and design a 5-kilometer diameter or 10-kilometer diameter grid, put a reactor or two in there. And that saves you having to run hundreds of kilometers of power lines first.
As an aside, do you happen to know how hot it would be down there where you were if there was no AC? If you shut off the AC for a few days, how hot would it be roughly, do you think?
Yeah, the wall temperature can reach 50 Celsius. It's quite hot. They drop ice down pipes from the surface all the way to the bottom. Big chunks of ice are made at the surface, drop to the bottom. Closed circuit, and ice then melts, and that water is then brought to the surface, part of the cooling mechanism. I went and had a look at the ice system at the top and watched all this ice pouring down these huge pipes to the bottom.
Elsewhere, you've talked about putting up a nuclear plant is sort of like buying a house versus renting a house. You want to talk about that a little bit? About the price?
Yes, okay. What you got in mind there is this cost. Now, people say nuclear is so expensive. It actually isn't. Currently in South Africa, nuclear is our cheapest electricity by far, and that's the Koeberg nuclear power station at Cape Town, which this year is 39 years old. And it's undergoing a refurbishment at the moment, which will extend its life by at least another 20 years. So it'll go for 60 years plus. I think it'll go longer than 20, but at least 60. So now it's producing the cheapest electricity. When I have confrontations with the anti-nuclear bodies and I say that it's only that much, it's so cheap, they say, oh, but that's unfair because the capital has been paid for. How can you say it's unfair? That's how it was designed. When you go and buy a house, typically, I remember clearly when I bought my house soon after graduating out of university, I went and signed there and bought this house, and I signed for more money than I possessed by far. I didn't have remotely the amount of money that I just signed away. And what you get is you get a scheme with the bank where you pay it off monthly. And as you pay off the house, after some years, the house is fully paid for. Then you live much more cheaply. And you say, well, that's why I did it. The alternative is you rent. And if you rent, every so often the rent goes up and the rent goes up. If you buy the house, you have a fixed amount per month that you pay off. And every time you pay it off, a bit of the capital is getting paid off. So actually your payments are in real terms going down and down and down. So eventually they reach zero. Then you can live for as long as you like without paying any rent. You only pay your lights and water and your city rates and so on. So when you decide to build a nuclear power station and you decide to put the money up front, it's like buying the house. When you put in a wind turbine or solar or something, it's much more like renting. And as time goes by, you're paying every month. So let's think about it's cheap. And then to have a look at what is the cost of electricity now, and they wangle it by saying, well, if you work out the total capital cost now, and you do some, I was being caustic, I was about to say clever maths, but you do that, then you say, look at this horrendous price. You say, but you can't work out that price unless you do it over at least 60 years or 40 years. And they don't. They take it over just a few years. And that you can't do. Nobody has a problem in building a multi-million rand or multi-million-dollar big building, and so we'll pay it off for a big factory. Why have a problem with a nuclear reactor? We've got the competent accountancy type people, economists who can work out the numbers perfectly easily, and it's totally affordable.
So is there a new argument that you're hearing more often about, oh, what about the cost of decommissioning the nuclear plants? And I'm curious if anyone's talking about decommissioning, like the wind turbine you mentioned. Are people talking about decommissioning that at the end of its life?
Well, no, now that you mentioned, that's also interesting because, nuclear has a sort of a lifetime of 40 years. Our big Koeberg power station has its 40th birthday in July next year, 2024. The reason why they have the 40 years is in the beginning, in the US, they said, look, once a nuclear power station is running, if the controlling company goes bankrupt, they can't just say, oh, we've gone bankrupt, we're going to pack it in. On Monday, we're going to just lock the door and walk away because you've got a reactor standing. You could do it with a coal-fired power station. You could just switch it off and walk away, and it just stands there and rots. You can't just let a reactor just stand. So you've got to have a responsibility for the duration of a lifetime. So they said back then, what's the lifetime for the reactor? People said, we don't know. We haven't run one long enough to find out. And the scientists sat down and did their discussions, and whoever did it at the time, they said, how about it, boys? What about 40 years? 40 sounds like a good idea. So they came up with the 40 years being a reasonable idea for there to be laws governing the responsibility of the owners until the end of the lifetime of the reactor, which was 40. It doesn't mean that when 40 comes, the thing falls apart. Here we get some of the anti-nuclears, oh no, but this reactor is 40 years old next year, which means it's disintegrating. It's not. It's perfectly okay. So then they say, all right, well, when the end of its lifetime comes, you've now got to take it apart. Yes, okay, you take the fuel out, the used fuel, and you take out some radioactive things. But some of them also do really dishonest calculations. So, oh no, decommissioning means you knock the building down, you destroy the concrete, you plow the land and turn it back into green grass and bushes and that like it was before you came there. And that's, again, what is your social decision as to what decommissioning means? So there's been decommissioning that's taken place in a number of places around the world already with absolutely no problem whatsoever. There's no problem. And nuclear is the only power source in the world where it's convention now where you pay into a decommissioning fund every month from the day the reactor starts operating. So when people say, where's the money coming from? One says it's paid into a fund. There's a decommissioning fund. We do that. And I don't see there being a problem. When you come to the end, if the reactor really is sufficiently old, you don't want to use it anymore, you take the fuel out and you go in there and you take it apart. The fact that it's radioactive, the nuclear scientists know exactly how to work with that stuff. So we, on a daily basis, work with very highly radioactive materials, much more than that, without being silly about this. I don't see decommissioning being a problem at all. It's just not the expense that it's made out to.
So this may be a loaded question, but for the safety of your family, where would you like to live? On the grounds of a nuclear plant or in a building with a bunch of EVs parked in the basement?
Well, I choose the nuclear power station any day. I think there's still going to be a lot of EV problems before the thing all settles down. Because unfortunately, EVs have been pushed very much by politics. It hasn't normally when a new technology comes about, it's market demand and science which causes it to be accepted. If somebody comes up with a new type of television that is good, the public buy it, the TV people make it. There usually isn't a government law saying you've got to buy the television that the government tells you to buy because you've got to save something or other. And that's what's been happening with EVs. Something that I've also had to try and explain to people in the public conversation, so to speak, is when you fill a battery with electricity, the energy's in there. In physics, the thermodynamics law says you cannot create or destroy energy. It goes from one form to another. Now, when you fill that electric battery with a whole lot of power, people don't realize that the power is in the battery. When you buy batteries for your torch, and you in the US call it a flashlight, the energy's in there, but it's so little that you don't really notice it. Where you can notice it with your motor car, if you take jumper cables and put them on the terminals of your battery that touch them, you see a spark, which is a bit scary. But it won't blow up and blow your head off. But it will when you've got one of these big batteries, an EV or one of these storage batteries connected to a wind turbine system. So when that car is parked, all that energy is sitting on the battery. If something goes wrong and it starts to come out, it can come out very explosive, and you can't stop it by pouring water on it, and it'll just keep coming out until the energy's out. And that's very scary. With people will say, oh, well, petrol in your motor car, same thing, but it isn't. The petrol, if you make a hole in the petrol tank, it'll run out. If you're fortunate, it'll just run away. If you're unfortunate, there's a spark that occurs and the petrol starts to burn. But it won't actually go off like a bomb. And if you look at YouTube, you'll find a few EV videos there of EVs really going off very violent. Living in the grounds of a nuclear power station, fine. In fact, in South Africa, we have a situation now where people are effectively trying to do things like that. When Kuberg was first mooted, this law, you would have a safety barrier. And they took the 5 miles that had come from the UK radius, and that becomes 8 kilometers. So they drew an 8-kilometer radius around the nuclear reactor, said, right, that's now a no-go zone for living. At that stage, the city of Cape Town's houses were quite far away. Over the years, housing development has come up and it met the southern border of the nuclear safety zone. They said, you can't build inside. And they've now jumped to the northern border and carried on up. So here you get this big area, 16 kilometers across on the coast in the middle of the housing. And now people have gone and brought lawsuits against various authorities demanding the right to be able to build houses inside the security area. Of course, that's not inside the actual reactor's grounds. It's much smaller, but this is the safety zone, which incidentally is a nature reserve around Kuberg. If you go there, you'll find zebra, eland, kudus, various animals wandering around the nuclear reactor. They do around the nuclear reactor in Pretoria too, by the way. There are only 2 nuclear reactors in the world where you can find zebras in the car park and things like that. And there's a nature reserve that's open to the public to go and hike in over weekends and have picnics. And you're not allowed to take vehicles in because you don't want vehicles driving around with hikers. So you concrete poles there to prevent people bringing vehicles in. But it's great to go and have a look and to look at bird life. So if I were authority to be able to live inside, it'd be wonderful. I'd be only too happy, perfectly safe.
Separately, you are a very informed climate skeptic, right? When I Googled you, I found that you wrote an article called ClimateGate 10 years later, talking about the fake climate crisis. Do you have anything you'd like to say about the climate debate at all?
Yeah, I think it's fake, as you put it. Look, there's no doubt that the planet has warmed by 1 degree since the time that Abraham Lincoln was president, right? And that, my hands have gone up by more than 1 degree by doing that. That's the temperature rise since the time of Abraham Lincoln, since the time of Queen Victoria, which also happens to be since the time that the Industrial Revolution started. But why do you always say since the Industrial Revolution started, as if it's a given that that's what did it? Why don't say since Queen Victoria, since Abraham Lincoln, since the time of Napoleon and things like this? They all at the same time. So there's no doubt that there's been a 1 degree rise. There's no doubt also that there's been an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide. Can you imagine now 10,000 golf balls lying out on the green at a golf course, for example? 10,000 golf balls. Take 4 of them and paint them red and throw them back. Those 4 represent if you take all those golf balls to equal the composition of the atmosphere, the 4 red ones are the total CO2 in the atmosphere. And of that total CO2 in the atmosphere, 1 of them has been added since the time of Queen Victoria. It's that 1 red golf ball out of 10,000 that everybody's panicking about right now. You really think that sounds like it's causing all the stuff that they say it's causing? So there's no doubt that there's been a temperature increase of 1. There's no doubt that there's been a CO2 increase to 420 parts per million, which is equal to one golf ball in the 10,000. That's true. What's not true is that there's been an enhanced greenhouse effect as a result of that, which is trapping heat and leading to a panic situation. That I do not believe. If you say also, well, what has caused the temperature to go up? The most likely cause is magnetic variations of the sun. Over periods of time, the sun warms and the sun cools a bit, but it's not the temperature of the sun warming and cooling that could cause it. There's not enough. So when you say in the sun, people say, oh, we looked at that, and the sun's temperature doesn't increase enough to cause global. That's true. What does happen is that the Earth's magnetic field alters, and the magnetic field is a screen around the planet, screening out cosmic rays coming from deep space. When the cosmic rays come in, they come shooting through the upper atmosphere and they nucleate water droplets, which is cloud. So when a lot of cosmic rays are coming down, they cause more cloud cover. And when there's few, there's less cloud cover. And that cloud cover is enough to account for the difference in the heat arriving at the surface of the Earth from the sun. You only need to change that by 10, 15% or something, and that's major. That's enough to account for all of the global warming. So I'm convinced in my own mind that the global warming is caused by variations in the magnetic field of the sun. If you look back, you'll find there was a medieval warm period. And that medieval warm period was warmer than now. You can look this up in the historical records. You can look it up in the scientific records. If you go back further, it's the Roman warming. If you go back further, it was the Minoan warming. And it seems to be on a cycle like that, pretty accurately. And we are in one of those now. Now, interesting enough, in between, you get periods of global cooling. And a severe one of recently was at the time of Shakespeare, which was at the same time that the first permanent settlers arrived in South Africa. His name, Jan van Riebeck from Holland, and arrived to start the first station. And 1620, when the Pilgrim Fathers arrived to start settlement in the United States. That was the period. It was so cold then that the Thames would freeze over. There's stories you can look up on the internet of an elephant walking down the Thames. There's pictures, paintings, many of them, of carriages carrying passengers riding up and down, the horse-drawn carriages going up and down the Thames. That ice fairs. That happened on the Thames at the time of the Little Ice Age. So if you took from 1650, for argument's sake, to 1850, there was massive global warming between the time of Shakespeare and 1850, which is when the industrial age started. So why do people only want to measure from 1850 to now? And what has happened is that there has been some warming taking place. There was some in the 1940s, which was the time of the Second World War, and when there wasn't all the industry now. Then in the 1970s, famously, we went into a period of global cooling, when prominent magazines were coming out with stories the whole Earth's going to freeze to death now because of the cooling. Then we went through that and started to come into a bit of a warming again. And now we're again getting slight warming. But also, if you look back in history, at the time of the medieval warm period compared to the Ice Age, to the other warm periods, the warm periods have all been periods of health, wealth, and prosperity, whereas the cold periods have been times of crop failures, disease, and so on. And it has been said that that little ice age was a contributing factor to the Pilgrim Fathers going to the United States. And at the same time, the Jan van Riebeck and the Dutch came to Cape Town because food was expensive back in the UK. And in Holland, there was disease. Life was pretty miserable. So they said, gee, things can't be much worse than this. Why don't we go somewhere else? Let's climb in a ship and try what will become the United States. Let's get in a ship and go to South Africa. And I imagine that's probably very much a case of what did happen. And also other reasons, of course. In our case, it was commercial. They wanted to stop over a point on the way to the spice trade of the Far East. But, it's just dishonest to pick some arbitrary place in time, which was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is sometime after that little ice age is recovering, and then picked down. So there's been an increase. And in fact, there's so little that it's silly. And I don't think that's it. So I think we're actually overreacting to cause all the damage that's been caused to the planet, like forcing energy poverty all over the place, not only in places like Africa, but Europe as well. There's indications now that many Germans can't afford their electricity bills. Germany is driving industry out of their country. I think they're still going to suffer a major backlash now by driving industry out and driving them to places like Korea and so on. In the UK, the current UK Prime Minister seems to have realized that. He's now saying, look, we've got to hang on to the industry, we can't drive them out. So I see a positive change in the attitude of many, but it's very difficult to get that embedded feeling out of people. So committed to the belief that we've got an absolute crisis in our hands.
All right, very well explained. We're coming up to the end of our hour here. Do you have any other points you'd like to make before we finish off?
Well, I'd like to say that undoubtedly the CO2 issue is a political reality right now. It is. And the answer to my mind is to go for nuclear, to go for small modular reactors. If you want to satisfy the politics, I don't think it can stop the CO2 because I think it's been caused by the sun. But right now, if you want to argue how do we stop the CO2 coming from coal, I think that's happening anyway. And it will accelerate once you bring nuclear in a larger fashion. We've got our HTMR 100. As I say, we're getting interest from all over the world, financiers calling us and inviting us for talks. We're getting a couple of weeks coming in. And people are saying, oh, I wonder if this is the right way to go. And it is. And we're getting inquiries from countries in Africa, but also as far afield as the Middle East, Australia, Indonesia, and so on. So that looks like the solution for our country, small modular reactors. When I met the head of nuclear of Indonesia, I said, oh, in my country, what these vast, open, dry spaces where to run power lines across. Yes, you're lucky. He said, my country's got thousands of islands. We got water in between. Oh my God, I hadn't thought. He said, how do we wire up all our islands? We can't put cables on. Very good point. So it's things like that that present themselves as requirements for a solution that does not require a standard national grid where everything's interconnected. So I see us going through a period now of having to rethink the whole electricity supply. Small modular reactors like our one has been developed privately in South Africa by our people. We're in a position to have private deals with people, and companies can buy them. The reactors are small enough and cheap enough that large companies can buy them. We found municipalities approaching us, provinces and states approaching us. It's not a case now that the nuclear reactor has to be owned by the state or by some very major portion of the state. They can be put in by a municipality and arrangements can be made. It's not at all difficult. And the hype around nuclear that has been in the past, that just everything is dangerous, it's bad, it's just wrong. You've got to start thinking correctly now and say this is the answer for where we stand with the world's politics right now.
All right, very good. On that note, I think we will wrap up, but thank you very much, Kelvin Kemm. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me on the show, Tom.
All right, goodbye.